Right. Wake me up a minute. All right. Let's see. Let's stop it where they were going for a hunt in the sea. Let's see. Chapter 15. A Walk on the Bottom of the Sea. The cell was, to speak correctly, the arsenal and wardrobe of the Nautilus. A dozen diving apparatuses hung from the partition, waiting our use. Ned Land, on seeing them, showed evident repugnance to dress himself in one. But, my worthy Ned, the forests of the island of Crispo are nothing but submarine forests. Good, said the disappointed harpooner, as his dreams of fresh meat fade away. And you, Mr. Aronnax, are you going to dress yourself in one of those clothes? There is no alternative, Master Ned. As you please, sir, replied the harpooner, shrugging his shoulders. But as of me, unless I am forced, I will never get into one. No one will force you, Master Ned, said Captain Nemo. Is Conseil going to risk it? Asked Ned. I follow my master wherever he goes, replied Conseil. Let's see what's his problem with that. At the captain's call, two of the ship's crew came to help us dress in these heavy and impervious clothes, made of India rubber without seam, and constructed expressly to resist considerable pressure. One could have thought it a suit of armor, both supple and resisting. This formed trousers and waistcoat. The trousers were finished off with thick boots, weighted with heavy leaden soles. The texture of the waistcoat was held together by bands of copper, which crossed the chest, protecting it from the great pressure of the water, and leaving the lungs free to act. The sleeves ended in gloves, which in no way restrained the movements of the hands. There was a vast difference noticeable between these consummate apparatuses and the old cork breastplates, jackets, and other contrivances in vogue during the 18th century. Captain Nemo and one of his companions, a sort of Hercules who must have possessed great strength, Conseil, and myself were soon enveloped in the dresses. There remained nothing more to be done but enclose our heads in the metal box. But before proceeding with this operation, I asked the captain's permission to examine the guns we were to carry. One of the Nautilus men gave me a simple gun, the butt end of which, made of steel, hollow in the center, was rather large. It served as a reservoir for compressed air, which a valve worked by a spring were forced into the barrel of the gun. As soon as one shot was fired, another was ready. "Captain Nemo," said I, "this arm is perfect and easily handled. I could only ask to be allowed to try it, but how shall we gain the bottom of the sea?" "At this moment, Professor, the Nautilus is stranded in 5 fathoms, and we have nothing to do but start." "And how shall we get off?" "You shall see." Captain Nemo thrust his head into the helmet. Conseil and I did the same, not without hearing an ironical "good sport" from the Canadian. The upper part of our dress terminated in a copper collar, upon which was screwed a metal helmet. These 3 holes, protected by thick glass, allowed us to see in all directions by simply turning our head in the interior of the headdress. As soon as it was in position, the boiquetrol apparatus on our backs began to act, and, for my part, I could breathe with ease. With a Ruhmkorff lamp hanging from my belt and the gun in my hand, I was ready to set out. But to speak the truth, imprisoned in these heavy garments and glued to the deck by my leaden soles, it was impossible for me to take a step. But this state of things was provided for. I felt myself being pushed into a little room contiguous to the wardrobe room. My companions followed, towed along in the same way. I heard the watertight door, furnished with stopper plates, close upon us, and we were trapped in profound darkness. After some minutes, a loud hissing was heard. I felt the cold mount my feet to my chest. Evidently, from some part of the vessel they had, by means of a tap, given entrance to the water, which was invading us, and with which the room was soon filled. A second door cut in the side of the Nautilus then opened. We saw a faint light. In another instant our feet trod the bottom of the sea. Nice. And now, how can I retrace the impression left upon me by that walk under the waters? Words are impotent to relate such wonders. Captain Nemo walked in front. His companion followed some steps behind. Conseil and I remained near each other, as if an exchange of words had been possible through our metallic cases. I no longer felt the weight of my clothing, or of my shoes, of my reservoir of air, or of my thick helmet, in the midst of which my head rattled like an almond in its shell. The light, which lit the soil 30 feet below the surface of the ocean, astonished me by its power. The solar rays shone through the watery mass easily and dissipated all color, and I clearly distinguished objects at a distance of 150 yards. Beyond that, the tints darkened into fine gradations of ultramarine and faded into vague obscurity. Surely, this water which surrounded me was but another air denser than the terrestrial atmosphere, but almost as transparent. Above me was the calm surface of the sea, a flat shore which retains the impression of the billows. This dazzling carpet, really a reflector, repelled the rays of the sun with wonderful intensity, which accounted for the vibration which penetrated every atom of liquid. Shall I believe it when I say that, at a depth of 30 feet, I could see as if I was in broad daylight? For a quarter of an hour I trod on the sand, sown with the impalpable dust of shells. The hull of the Nautilus, resembling a long shoal, disappeared by degrees, but its lantern, when darkness should overtake us in the waters, would help guide us on board by its distinct rays. Soon forms of objects outlined in the distance were discernible. I recognized magnificent rocks, hung with a tapestry of zoophytes and the most beautiful kind. And I was at first struck by the peculiar effect of this medium. It was then 10 in the morning. The rays of the sun struck the surface of the waves at rather an oblique angle, and at the touch of their light decomposed by refraction as though a prism. Flowers, rocks, plants, shells, and polypili were shaded at the edges of the 7 solar colors. It was marvelous, at least for the eyes, this complication of colored tints, a perfect kaleidoscope of green, yellow, orange, violet, indigo, and blue. In one word, the whole palette of an enthusiast colorist. Why could I not communicate to Conseil the lively sensations which were mounting on my brain and rival hailing expressions of admiration? For aught I knew, Captain Nemo and his companion might be able to exchange thoughts by means of signs previously agreed upon. So, for want of better, I talked to myself. I declaimed in the copper hawks which covered my head, thereby expending more air in vain words than perhaps was expedient. Various kinds of yeasts, clusters of pure tufted coral, prickly fungi, and anemones formed a brilliant garden of flowers, enameled with porphytae, decked with their colorets of blue tentacles, sea stars studding the sandy bottom, together with asteropythons, like fine lace embroidered by the hands of naiads, whose festoons were waved by the gentle undulations caused by our walk. It was real grief to me to crush under my feet the brilliant specimens of mollusks which strewed the ground by thousands, of hammerheads, donaceae, veritable bonding shells, of staircases and head-helmet shells, angel wings, and many others produced by this inexhaustible ocean. But we were bound to walk, so we went on, whilst above our heads waved shoals of physalis, leaving their tentacles to float in their train. Medusa was umbrellas of opal or rose pink, escalloped with a hand of blue, sheltered us from the rays of the sun, and Fury Pelagiae, which in the darkness would have strewn our path with phosphorescent light. All these wonders I saw in the space of a quarter mile, scarcely stopping, and following Captain Nemo, who beckoned me on by signs, soon the nature of the soil changed. To the sandy plain succeeded an extent of slimy mud, which the Americans call ooze, composed of equal parts of siliceous and calcareous shells. We then travelled over a plain of seaweed of wild and luxuriant vegetation. The sward was of close texture and soft to the feet, and rivaled the softest carpet woven by the hand of man. But whilst verdure was spread on our feet, it did not abandon our heads. A light network of marine plants, of that inexhaustible family of seaweeds, of which more than 2,000 kinds are known, grew on the surface of the water. I saw long ribbons of fucus floating, some globular, others tuberous, Lawrencei and Cladostephae of most delicate foliage, and some Rhodomeniae palmate resembling the fan of a cactus. I noticed that the green plants kept nearer the top of the sea, whilst the red were at a greater depth, leaving to the black or brown hydrophytes the care of forming gardens and parterres in the remote beds of the ocean. We had quitted the Nautilus about an hour and a half. It was near noon. I knew by the perpendicularity of the sun's rays, which were no longer refracted. The magical colors disappeared by degrees, and the shades of emerald and sapphire were effaced. We walked with a regular step, which rang upon the ground with astonishing intensity. The slightest noise was transmitted with a quickness to which the ear is unaccustomed to on the earth. Indeed, water is a better conductor of sound than air, in the ratio of 4 to 1. At this period the earth sloped downwards, the light took a uniform tint. We were at a depth of 105 yards and 20 inches, undergoing a pressure of 6 atmospheres. At this depth I could still see the rays of the sun, though feebly. To their intense brilliance had succeeded a reddish twilight, the lowest state between day and night. But we could still see well enough. It was not necessary to resort to the Hookham apparatus as yet. At this moment Captain Nemo stopped. He waited till I joined him, and then pointed to an obscure mass, looming in the shadow, at a short distance. "It is the forest of the island of Crespo," thought I, and I was not mistaken. Chapter 16: A Submarine Forest. We had at last arrived on the borders of this forest, doubtless one of the finest of Captain Nemo's immense domains. He looked upon it as his own, and considered he had the same right over it that the first man had in the first days of the world. And indeed, we would have disputed with him the possession of this submarine property. What other hardier pioneer would come, hatchet in hand to cut down the dark copses. This forest was composed of large tree plants, and the moment we penetrated under its vast arcades, I was struck by the singular position of the branches, position I had not yet observed. Not a herb which carpeted the ground, not a branch which clove the trees, was either broken or bent, nor did they extend horizontally. All stretched up to the surface of the ocean. Not a filament, not a ribbon, however thin they might be, but kept as straight as the rod of an iron. The fuci and lianas grew in the rigid perpendicular lines, due to the density of the element which had produced them. Motionless, yet when bent to the side by the hand, they directly resumed their former position. Truly, it was the region of perpendicularity. I soon accustomed myself to this fantastic position, as well as to the comparative darkness which surrounded us. The soil of the forest seemed covered with sharp blocks, difficult to avoid. The submarine flora struck me as being very perfect, and richer even than it would have been in the Arctic or tropical zones, where these productions are not so plentiful. But for some minutes I involuntarily confounded the genera, taking zoophytes for hydrophytes, animals for plants, and we will not have been mistaken. The fauna and the flora are too closely allied in the submarine world. These plants are self-propagated, and the principle of their existence is in the water, which upholds and nourishes them. The greater number, instead of leaves, shot forth blades of capricious shapes, comprised within a scale of colors: pink, carmine, green, olive, fawn, and brown. I saw there, but not dried up, as our specimens of the Nautilus are, Pavonari spread like a fan, as if to catch the breeze, scarlet Ceramis, whose laminaries extended their edible shoots of fan-shaped Myriocystis, which grow to a height of 15 feet, clusters of acetabuli, whose stems increase in size upwards, and numbers of other marine plants, all devoid of flowers. Curious anomaly, fantastic element, said an ingenious naturalist, in which the animal kingdom blossoms and the vegetable does not. Under these numerous shrubs, as large as trees of the temperature zone, and under their damp shadow, were massed together real bushes of living flowers, heads of zoophytes, on which blossomed some zebra meandrines, with crooked grooves, some yellow Caryophycellae, and, to complete the illusion, the fish flies flew from branch to branch like a swarm of hummingbirds, whilst yellow Lepisaconti, with bristling jaws, Dactylopteri, and monocentrids rose at our feet like a flight of snipes. In about an hour, Captain Nemo gave the signal to halt. I, for my part, was not sorry, and we stretched ourselves on an harbour of Alariae, the long thin blades of which stood up like arrows. This short rest seemed delicious to me. There was nothing wanting but the charm of conversation. But impossible to speak, impossible to answer, I only put my great copper head to counsels. I saw the worthy fellow's eyes glistening with delight, and to show his satisfaction, he shook himself in his breastplate of hair in the most comical way in the world. After 4 hours of this walking, I was surprised not to find myself dreadfully hungry. How to account for this state of the stomach I could not tell, but instead I felt an insurmountable desire to sleep, which happens to all divers, and my eyes soon closed behind the thick glasses, and I fell into a heavy slumber, which the movement alone had prevented before. Captain Nemo and his robust companion, stretched in the clear crystal, set us the example. How long I remained buried in this drowsiness I cannot judge, but when I awoke, the sun seemed sinking towards the horizon. Captain Nemo had already risen, and I was beginning to stretch my limbs, when an unexpected apparition brought me briskly to my feet. A few steps off, a monstrous sea spider, about 38 inches high, was watching me with squinting eyes, ready to spring upon me. Though my diver's dress was thick enough to defend me from the bite of this animal, I could not help shuddering with the horror. Conseil and the sailor of the Nautilus awoke at this moment. Captain Nemo pointed out the hideous crustacean, which a blow from the butt end of the gun knocked over, and I saw the horrible claws of the monster writhe in terrible convulsions. This accident reminded me that other animals were more to be feared might haunt these obscure depths, against whose attacks my diving dress would not protect me. I had never thought of it before, but I now resolved to be upon my guard. Indeed, I thought that this halt would mark the termination of our walk, but I was mistaken, for instead of returning to the Nautilus, Captain Nemo continued his whole excursion. The ground was still on the incline, its declivity seemed to be getting greater, and to be leading us to greater depths. It must have been about 3 o'clock when we reached a narrow valley, between high perpendicular walls, situated in about 75 fathoms deep. Thanks to the perfection of our apparatus, we were 45 fathoms below the limit which nature seems to have imposed on man as his swimmer in excursions. I say 75 fathoms, though I had no instrument by which to judge the distance. But I knew that even in the clearest waters the solar rays could not penetrate further, and accordingly the darkness deepened. At 10 paces not an object was visible. I was groping my way when I suddenly saw a brilliant white light. Captain Nemo had just put his electric apparatus into use. His companion did the same, and Conseil and I followed their example. By turning a screw, I established a communication between the wire and the spiral glass, and the sea, lit by our 4 lanterns, was illuminated by a circle of 36 yards. Captain Nemo was still plunging into the dark depths of the forest, whose trees were getting scarcer at every step. I noticed that vegetable life disappeared sooner than animal life. The Medusae had already abandoned the arid soil, from which a great number of animals, zoophytes, articulata, molluscs, and fishes still obtained sustenance. As we walked, I thought the light of our Ruhmkorff apparatus could not fail to draw some inhabitant from its dark couch. But if they did approach us, they at least kept a respectful distance from the hunters. Several times I saw Captain Nemo stop, put his gun to his shoulder, and after some moments drop it and walk on. At last, after about 4 hours, this marvelous excursion came to an end. A wall of superb rocks in an imposing mass rose before us, a heap of gigantic blocks, an enormous steep granite shore, forming dark grottos, but which presented no practicable slope. Oh, hey there. Morning, killer. It was the prop of the island of Crespo. It was the earth. Captain Nemo stopped suddenly. A gesture of his brought us all to a halt, and however desirous I might be to scale the wall, I was obliged to stop. He rendered Captain Nemo's domains, and he would not go beyond them. Further on was a portion of the globe he might not trample upon. The return began. Captain Nemo had returned to the head of his little band, directing their course without hesitation. I thought we were not following the same road to return to the Nautilus. The new road was very steep and consequently very painful. We approached the surface of the sea rapidly, but this return to the upper strata was not so sudden as to cause relief from the pressure too rapidly, which might have produced serious disorder in our organization and brought on internal lesions so fatal to divers. Decompression is a problem with divers even today. The bends is caused by excess nitrogen forced into the blood by pressure. The remedy is to reduce pressure slowly in a decompression chamber. Very soon light reappeared and grew, and the sun being low on the horizon, the refraction edged different objects with a spectral ring. At 10 yards and a half deep, we walked amidst a show of little fishes of all kinds, more numerous than the birds in the air, and also more agile. But no aquatic game worthy of a shot had as yet met our gaze. When at that moment I saw the captain shoulder his gun quickly and follow a moving object into the shrubs. He fired. I heard a slight hissing, and the creature fell stunned at some distance from us. It was a magnificent sea otter, an anhydrus, the only exclusive marine quadruped. This otter was 5 feet long and must have been very valuable. Its skin, chestnut brown above and silvery underneath, would have made one of those beautiful furs so sought after in the Russian and Chinese markets. The fineness and the lustre of its coat would certainly fetch 80 euros. I admire this curious mammal, with its rounded head ornamented with short ears, its round eyes and white whiskers like those of a cat, with webbed feet and nails, and tufted tail. This precious animal, hunted and tracked by fishermen, has now become very rare and taken refuge chiefly in the northern parts of the Pacific, or probably its race would soon become extinct. Captain Nemo's companion took the beast, threw it over his shoulder, and we continued our journey. For an hour, a plain sand lay stretched before us. Sometimes it rose to within 2 yards and some inches of the surface of the water. I then saw our image clearly reflected, drowning vertically, and above us appeared an identical group reflecting our movements and our actions. In a word, like us in every point, except that they walked with their heads downward and their feet in the air. Another effect I noticed, which was the passage of thick clouds which formed and vanished rapidly. But on reflection, I understood that these seeming clouds were due to the varying thickness of the reeds at the bottom, and I could even see the fleecy foam which their broken tops multiplied on the water, and the shadows of large birds passing above our heads, whose rapid flight I could discern on the surface of the sea. On this occasion, I was witness to one of the finest gunshots which ever made the nerves of a hunter thrill. A large bird of great breadth of wing, clearly visible, approached, hovering over us. Captain Nemo's companion shouldered his gun and fired, when it was only a few yards above the waves. The creature fell stunned, and the force of its fall brought it within reach of the dexterous hunter's grasp. It was an albatross of the finest kind. Our march had not been interrupted by this incident. For 2 hours we followed these sandy plains, then fields of algae very disagreeable to cross. Candidly, I could do no more when I saw a glimmer of light, which, for half a mile, broke the darkness of the waters. It was the lantern of the Nautilus. Before 20 minutes were over, we should be on board, and I should be able to breathe with ease, for it seemed that my reservoir supplied air very deficient in oxygen. But I did not reckon on an accidental meeting, which delayed our arrival for some time. Albert remained some steps behind, when I presently saw Captain Nemo coming hurriedly towards me. With his strong hand he bent me to the ground, his companion doing the same to Conseil. At first I knew not what to think of this sudden attack, but I was soon reassured by seeing the captain lie down beside me and remain immovable. I was stretched on the ground, just under shelter of a bush of algae, when, raising my head, I saw some enormous mass casting phosphorescent gleams, blustering by. My blood froze in my veins as I recognized two formidable sharks which threatened us. It was a couple of Tintorias, terrible creatures, with enormous tails and a dull glassy stare. The phosphorescent matter ejected from holes pierced around the muzzle. Monstrous brutes, which would crush a whole man in their iron jaws. I did not know whether Conseil stopped to classify them. For my part, I noticed their silver bellies and their huge mouths bristling with teeth, from a very unscientific point of view, and more as a possible victim than as a naturalist. Happily, the voracious creatures do not see well. They passed without seeing us, brushing us with their brownish fins, and we escaped by a miracle from a danger certainly greater than meeting a tiger full face in the forest. Half an hour after, guided by the electric light, we reached the Nautilus. The outside door had been left open, and Captain Nemo closed it as soon as we had entered the first cell. He then pressed the knob. I heard the pumps working in the midst of the vessel. I felt the water sinking from around me, and in a few moments the cell was entirely empty. The inside door then opened, and we entered into the vestry. There, our diving dress was taken off, not without some trouble, and, fairly worn out from want of food and sleep, I returned to my room, in great wonder at this surprising excursion of the bottom of the sea. Chapter 70 4,000 Leagues Under the Pacific. Take something. The next morning, the 8th of November, I had quite recovered from my fatigues of the day before, and I went up on the platform, just as the second lieutenant was uttering his daily phrase. I was admiring the magnificent aspect of the ocean when Captain Nemo appeared. He did not seem to be aware of my presence, and began a series of astronomical observations. Then, when he was finished, he went and leaned on the cage of the watchlight and gazed abstractedly on the ocean. In the meantime, a number of the sailors of the Nautilus, all strong and healthy men, had come up to the platform. They came to draw up the nets that had been laid all night. The sailors were evidently of different nations, although the European type was visible in all of them. I recognized some unmistakable Irishmen, Frenchmen, some Slavs, and a Greek or a Candiote. They were civil and only used that odd language among themselves, the origin of which I could not guess, neither could I question them. The nets were hauled in. They were a large kind of charlottes, like those on the Normandy coasts. Great pockets that the waves and a chain fixed in the smaller meshes kept open. These pockets, drawn by iron poles, swept through the water and gathered in everything in its way. That day they brought up curious specimens from those productive coasts, fishing frogs that, from their comical movements, have acquired the name of buffoons. black commersons, black commersons, furnished with antennae, triggerfish encircled with red hands, Orthogorici with very subtle venom, some olive-colored lampreys, Marcorinthi covered with silvery scales, Trichiuri, the electric power of which is equal to that of the gymnotus and crampfish, Scaled which with transverse brown bands, greenish cod, several varieties of gobies, etc. Also some larger fish, a caranx with a prominent head a yard long, several fine bonitos streaked with blue and silver, and three splendid tunnies, which, spite of the swiftness of their motion, had not escaped the net. I reckon that the haul had brought in more than 900 weight of fish. It was a fine haul, but not to be wondered at. Indeed, the nets are let down for several hours, and enclose in their meshes an infinite variety. We had no lack of excellent food, and the rapidity of the Nautilus and the attraction of the electric light could always renew our supply. The several productions of the sea were immediately lowered through the panel to the steward's room, some to be eaten fresh, and others pickled. The fishing ended, the provision of air renewed, I thought that the Nautilus was about to continue its submarine excursion, and was preparing to return to my room, when, without further preamble, the captain turned to me, saying, "Professor, if not this ocean, is not this ocean gifted with real life? It has its tempers and its gentle moods. Yesterday it slept as we did, and now it has woke after a quiet night. Look," he continued, "it wakes under the caresses of the sun. It is going to renew its diurnal existence. It is an interesting study to watch the play of this organization. It has a pulse, arteries, spasms, and I agree with the learned Maori, who discovered in it a circulation as real as the circulation of blood in animals. Yes, the ocean has indeed circulation, and to promote it, the Creator has caused things to multiply in it, caloric, salt, and animalculae. When Captain Nemo spoke thus, he seemed altogether changed, and aroused an extraordinary emotion in me. Also, he added, true existence is there, and I can imagine the foundations of nautical towns, clusters of submarine houses, which, like the Nautilus, would ascend every morning to breathe at the surface of the water, free towns, independent cities. Yet, who knows whether some despot... Captain Nemo finished his sentence with a violent gesture. Then, addressing me as if to chase away some sorrowful thought, "Mr. Aronnax," he asked, "do you know the depth of the ocean?" "I only know, Captain, what the principal soundings have taught us." "Could you tell me, then, so that I can suit them to my purpose?" "These are some," I replied, "that I remember. If I am not mistaken, a depth of 8,000 yards has been found in the North Atlantic, and 2,500 yards in the Mediterranean. The most remarkable soundings have been made in the South Atlantic, near the 30 parallel, and they gave 12,000 yards, 14,000 yards, and 50,000 yards. To sum up it all, it is reckoned that if the bottom of the sea were leveled, its mean depth would be about 1¾ leagues. Well, Professor, replied the captain, we shall show you better than that, I hope. As to the mean depth of this part of the Pacific, I tell you it is only 4,000 yards. Having said this, Captain Nemo went towards the panel and disappeared down the ladder. I followed him and went into the large drawing room. The screw was immediately put in motion, and the log gave 20 miles an hour. During the days and weeks that passed, Captain Nemo was very sparing with his visits. I seldom saw him. The lieutenant pricked the ship's course regularly on the chart, so I could always tell exactly the route of the Nautilus. Nearly every day, for some time, the panels of the drawing room were open, and we were never tired of penetrating the mysteries of the submarine world. The general direction of the Nautilus was southeast, and it kept between 100 and 150 yards of depth. One day, however, I do not know why, being drawn diagonally by means of the inclined planes, it touched the bed of the sea. The thermometer indicated a temperature of 4.25 centigrades, a temperature that at this depth seemed common to all latitudes. At 3 o'clock in the morning of the 26th of November, the Nautilus crossed the Tropic of Cancer at 172 degrees longitude. On the 27th instant, it sighted the Sandwich Islands, where Cook died, February 14, 79. We had then gone 4,860 leagues from our starting point. In the morning, when I went on the platform, I saw, 2 miles to windward, Hawaii, the largest of the 7 islands that form the group. I saw clearly the cultivated ranges and the several mountain chains that run parallel with the side, and the volcanoes that overtop Mauna Rea, which rise 4,000 yards above the level of the sea. Besides other things the nets brought up were several flaberiae and graceful polypi that are peculiar to that part of the ocean. The direction of the Nautilus was still to the southeast. It crossed the equator December 1st and 142 degrees longitude, and on the 4th of the same month, after crossing rapidly and without anything particular occurring, we sighted the Marquesas group. I saw 3 miles off, at 8 degrees 57 latitude south and 139 degrees 32 west longitude, Martin's Peak in Noka River, the largest of the group against the horizon, because Captain Nemo did not wish to bring the ship to the wind. There the nets brought up beautiful specimens of fish. Florifins with azure fins and tails like gold, the flesh of which is unrivaled. Hologeomnosis, nearly destitute of scales, but of exquisite flavor. pastorines with bony jaws, and yellow-tinged lizards, as good as bonitos, all fish that would be of use to us. After leaving these charming islands protected by the French flag, from the 4th to the 11th of December the Nautilus sailed over about 2,000 miles. This navigation was remarkable for the meeting with an immense shoal of calmars, near neighbors to the Cuttle. The French fishermen called them hornets. They belong to the cephalopod class and to the Tibranchial family that comprehends the Cuttles and the Argonauts. These animals were particularly studied by students of antiquity, and they furnished numerous metaphors to the popular orators, as well as excellent dishes for the tables of the rich citizens, if one can believe Athenaeus, a Greek doctor who lived before Galen. It was during the night of the 9th to the 10th of December that the Nautilus came across this shoal of mollusks that are peculiarly nocturnal. One could count them by millions. They emigrate from the temperate to the warmer zones, following the track of herrings and sardines. We watched them through the thick crystal panes, swimming down the wind with great rapidity, moving by means of their locomotive tube, pursuing fish and mollusks, eating the little ones, eaten by the big ones, and tossing about an indescribable confusion the 10 arms that nature has placed on their heads like a crest of pneumatic serpents. The Nautilus, in spite of its speed, sailed for several hours in the midst of these animals, and its nets brought in an enormous quantity, among which I recognized the 9 species that D'Orbigny classed for the Pacific. One saw, while crossing, that the sea displays the most wonderful sights. They were in endless variety. The scene changed continually, and we were called upon not only to contemplate the works of the Creator in the midst of the liquid element, but to penetrate the awful mysteries of the ocean. During the daytime of the 11th of December, I was busy reading in the large drawing room. Ned Land and Conseil watched the luminous water through the half-open panels. The Nautilus was immovable. While its reservoirs were filled, it kept at a depth of 1,000 yards, a region rarely visited in the ocean, and in which large fish were seldom seen. I was then reading a charming book by Jean Macé, The Slaves of the Stomach, and I was learning some valuable lessons from it, when Conseil interrupted me. "Will master come here for a moment?" he said, in a curious voice. "What is the matter, Conseil?" "I want master to look." I rose, went and leaned on my elbows before the panes and watched. In a full electric light, an enormous black mass, quite immovable, was suspended in the midst of the waters. I watched attentively, seeking to find out the nature of this gigantic cetacean. But a sudden thought crossed my mind. "A vessel," I said, half aloud. "Yes," replied the Canadian, "a disabled ship that has sunk perpendicularly." Ned Land was right. We were close to a vessel of which the tattered shrouds still hung from their chains. The keel seemed to be in good order, and it had been wrecked at most some few hours. Three stumps of masts broken off about 2 feet above the bridge showed that the vessel had had to sacrifice its masts. But lying on its side, it had filled, and it was heeling over to port. The skeleton of what it had once been was a sad spectacle as it lay lost under the waves. But sadder still was the sight of the bridge, where some corpses, bound with ropes, were still lying. I counted 4 men, one of whom was standing at the helm, and a woman standing by the poop, holding an infant in her arms. She was quite young. I could distinguish her features, which the water had not decomposed, by the brilliant light from the Nautilus. In one despairing effort, she had raised her infant above her head. Poor little thing, whose arms encircled its mother's neck. The attitude of the 4 sailors was frightful, distorted as they were by their convulsive movements, whilst making a last effort to free themselves from the cords that bound them to the vessel. The steersman, alone, calm, with a grave, clear face, his grey hair glued to his forehead, and his hand clutching the wheel of the helm, seemed even then to be guiding the 3 broken masts through the depths of the ocean. What a scene! We were dumb. Our hearts beat fast before this shipwreck, taken as it were from life and photographed in its last moments. And I saw already, coming towards it with hungry eyes, enormous sharks attracted by the human flesh. However, the Nautilus, turning, went round the submerged vessel, and in one instant I read on the stern, "The Florida, Sunderland." Sad. Chapter 18, Vanikoro. This terrible spectacle was the forerunner of the series of maritime catastrophes that the Nautilus was destined to meet with its route. As long as it went through more frequented waters, we often saw the hulls of shipwrecked vessels that were rotting in the depths, and deeper down, cannons, bullets, anchors, chains, and 1,000 other iron materials eaten up by rust. It's almost like a living museum. However, on the 11th of December, we sighted the Pomotou Islands and the old dangerous group of Bougainville that extend over a space of 500 leagues at ESE to WNW, from the island Doucier to that of Lazareff. This group covers an area of 370 square leagues, and it is formed of 60 groups of islands, among which the Gambier group is remarkable, over which France exercises sway. These are coral islands, slowly raised, but continuous, created by the daily work of polypi. When this new island will be joined later on to the neighboring groups, and a fifth continent will stretch from New Zealand and New Caledonia, and from thence to the Marquesas. One day, when I was suggesting this theory to Captain Nemo, he replied coldly, "The Earth does not want new continents, but new men." Chance had conducted the Nautilus towards the island of Clermont-Tonnerre, one of the most curious of the group. That was discovered in 1822 by Captain Bell of the Minerva. I could study now the madreporal system to which are due the islands of this ocean. Madrepores, which must not be mistaken for corals, have a tissue lined with a calcareous crust, and the modifications of its structure have induced Mr. Milne Edwards, my worthy master, to class them into 5 sections. The animalculae that the marine polypus secretes live by millions at the bottom of their cells. Their calcareous deposits become rocks, reefs, and large and small islands. Here they form a ring, surrounding a little inland lake that communicates with the sea by means of gaps. There they make barriers of reefs like those on the coasts of the New Caledonia and the various Pomoton Islands. In other places, like those at Reunion and at Maurice, they raise fringed reefs, high, straight walls, near which the depth of the ocean is considerable. Some cable lengths off the shores of the island of Clermont, I admire the gigantic work accomplished by those microscopic workers. These walls are especially the work of those madrepores known as milleporas, porites, madrepores, and astraeas. These polypi are found particularly in the rough beds of the sea, near the surface, and consequently it is from the upper part that they begin their operations, in which they bury themselves by degrees with the debris of the secretions that support them. Such is, at least, Darwin's theory, but thus explains the formation of the atolls, a superior theory, to my mind, to that given of the foundation of the madreporal works. Summits of mountains or volcanoes that are submerged some feet below level of the sea. I could observe closely these curious walls, for perpendicularly they were more than 300 yards deep, and our electric sheets lighted up this calcareous matter brilliantly. Replying to a question Conseil asked me as to the time these colossal barriers took to be raised, I astonished him much by telling him that learned men reckoned it about the eighth of an inch in 100 years. Towards evening, Clermont-Tonnerre was lost in the distance, and the route of the Nautilus was sensibly changed. After having crossed the Tropic of Capricorn in 135 degrees longitude, it sailed west W, making again for the tropical zone. Although the summer's sun was very strong, we did not suffer from heat, for at 15 or 20 fathoms below the surface, the temperature did not rise above 10 to 12 degrees. On December 15, we left to the east the bewitching group of the Societies and the graceful Tahiti, Queen of the Pacific. I saw in the morning, some miles to the windward, the elevated summits of the island. These waters furnished our table with excellent fish, mackerel, bonitos, and albicores, and some varieties of a sea serpent called munirophis. On the 25th of December, the Nautilus sailed into the midst of the New Hebrides, discovered by Quiros in 66, and that Bougainville explored in 768, and which Cook gave its present name in 1773. This group is composed principally of 9 large islands that form a band of 120 leagues NNS to SSW between 50 degrees and 2 degrees south latitude and 164 degrees and 168 degrees longitude. We passed tolerably near to the island of Aurora, that at noon looked like a mass of green woods surmounted by a peak of great height. That day being Christmas Day, Ned Land seemed to regret sorely the non-celebration of Christmas, the family feast of which Protestants are so fond. I had not seen Captain Nemo for a week, when, on the morning of the 27th, he came into the large drawing room, always seeming as if he had seen you 5 minutes before. I was busily tracing the route of the Nautilus on the planisphere. The captain came up to me, put his finger on one spot on the chart, and said the single word, Vanikoro. The effect was magical. It was the name of the islands on which La Pérouse had been lost. I rose suddenly. "The Nautilus has brought us to Vanikoro?" I asked. "Yes, Professor," said the captain, "and I can visit the celebrated island where the Bull and the Astrolabe struck? If you like, Professor." "When shall we be there?" "We are there now." Followed by Captain Nemo, I went up on the platform and greedily scanned the horizon. To the northeast, 2 volcanic islands emerged, of unequal size, surrounded by a coral reef that measured 40 miles in circumference. We were close to Vanikoro, really the one to which Dumont d'Urville gave the name of Isle de la Recherche, and exactly facing the little harbor of Vano, situated in 16 degrees 4 south latitude and 164 degrees 32 east longitude. The earth seemed covered with verdure from the shore to the summits in the interior, that were crowned by Mount Kapogo, 476 feet high. The Nautilus, having passed the other belt of rocks by a narrow strait, found itself among breakers where the sea was from 30 to 40 fathoms deep. Under the verdant shade of some mangroves, I perceived some savages who appeared surprised at our approach. In the long black body, moving between wind and water, did they not see some formidable cetacean that they regarded with suspicion? Just then, Captain Nemo asked me what I knew about the wreck of La Pérouse. Only what everyone knows, Captain, I replied. And could you tell me what everyone knows about it? He inquired, ironically. Easily. I related to him all that the last works of Dumont d'Urville had made known, works from which the following is a brief account. La Pérouse and his second, Captain Delangle, were sent by Louis XVI in 1785 on a voyage of circumnavigation. They embarked in the corvettes the Boussole and the Astrolabe, neither of which were again heard of. In 1791, the French government, justly uneasy as to the fate of these two sloops, manned two large merchantmen, the Recherche and the Esperance, which left Brest on the 28th of September under the command of Bruni d'Entrecasteaux. 2 months after, they learned from Bowen, a commander of the Albemarle, that the debris of shipwrecked vessels had been on the coast of New Georgia. But D'Entrecasteaux, ignoring this communication, rather uncertain besides, directed his course towards the Admiralty Isles, mentioned in a report of Captain Hunter's as being the place where La Pérouse was wrecked. They sought in vain. The Esperance and the Recherche passed before Vanikoro without stopping there, and in fact this voyage was most disastrous, as it cost D'Entrecasteaux his life, and those of 2 of his lieutenants, besides several of his crew. Captain Dillon, a shrewd old Pacific sailor, was the first to find unmistakable traces of the wrecks. On the 15th of May, 1824, his vessel, the St. Patrick, passed close to Tikopia, one of the New Hebrides. There, a Lascar came alongside in a canoe, sold him the handle of a sword in silver that bore the print of characters engraved on the hilt. The Lascar pretended that 6 years before, during a stay at Vanikoro, he had seen 2 Europeans that belonged to some vessels that had run aground on the reef some years ago. Dillon guessed that he meant La Pérouse, whose disappearance had troubled the whole world. He tried to get on to Vanikoro, where, according to Lascar, he would find numerous debris of the wreck. But winds and tide prevented him. Dillon returned to Caleuta. There, he interested the Asiatic Society and the Indian Company in his discovery. A vessel, to which was given the name of the Recherche, was put at his disposal, and he set out, January 23, 1827, accompanied by a French agent. The Recherche, after touching at several points in the Pacific, cast anchor before Vanikoro, July 7, 1827. In that same harbor of Vano where the Nautilus was at this time. There it collected numerous relics of the wreck: iron utensils, anchors, pulley strops, swivel guns, and 18 pounds shot, fragments of astronomical instruments, a piece of crownwork, and a bronze clock bearing this inscription: Bazin Mafate, the mark of the foundry of the arsenal at Brest about 1785. There could be no further doubt. Dillon, having made all inquiries, stayed in the unlucky place till October. Then he quitted Vanikoro and directed his course towards New Zealand, putting to Calcutta April 7, 1828, and returned to France, where he was warmly welcomed by Charles X. But at the same time, without knowing Dillon's movements, Dumont d'Urville had already set out to find the scene of the wreck, and they had learned from a whaler that some medals and a cross of St. Louis had been found in the hands of some savages of Louisiade and New Caledonia. Dumont d'Urville, commander of the Astrolabe, had then sailed, and 2 months after Dillon had left Vanikoro, he put into Hobart Town. There he learned the results of Dillon's inquiries and found that a certain James Hobbs, second lieutenant of the Union of Calcutta, after landing on an island situated 8 degrees 18 south latitude and 156 degrees 30 east longitude, had seen some iron bars and red stuffs used by the natives of these parts. Dumont d'Urville, much perplexed and not knowing how to credit the reports of low-class journals, decided to follow Dillon's track. On the 10th of February, 1828, the Astrolabe appeared off Tikopia and took as guide and interpreter a deserter found on the island. Made his way to Vanikoro, sighted on the 12th inst, lay along the reefs until the 14th, and not until the 20th did he cast anchor within the barrier in the harbor of Vano. On the 23rd, several officers went round the island and brought back some unimportant trifles. The natives, adopting a system of denials and evasions, refused to take them to the unlucky place. This ambiguous conduct led them to believe that the natives had ill-treated the castaways, and indeed they seemed to fear that Dumont d'Urville had come to avenge La Pérouse and his unfortunate crew. However, on the 26th, appeased by some presents, and understanding that they had no reprisals to fear, they led Mr. Jacquirot to the scene of the wreck. There, in 3 or 4 fathoms of water, between reefs of Paco and Vano, lay anchors, cannons, pigs of lead and iron, embedded in limy concretions. The large boat and the whaler belonging to the Astrolabe were sent to this place, and, not without some difficulty, their crews hauled up an anchor weighing 1,800 pounds, a brass gun, some pigs of iron, and 2 copper swivel guns. Dumont d'Urville, questioning the natives, learned too that La Pérouse, after losing both his vessels on the reefs of this island, had constructed a smaller boat, only to be lost a second time. Where? No one knew. But the French government, fearing that Dumont d'Urville was not acquainted with Dillon's movements, had sent the sloop Bayonnaise, commanded by Legourant de Tromelin, to Vanikoro, which had been stationed on the west coast of America. The Bayonnaise cast her anchor before Vanikoro some months after the departure of the Astrolabe, but found no new document, but stated that the savage had respected the monument to La Pérouse. That in the substance of what I told to Captain Nemo. That is the substance of what I told Captain Nemo. So, he said, no one knows now where the third vessel perished that was constructed by the castaways on the islands of Vanikoro. No one knows. Captain Nemo said nothing, but signed to me to follow him into the large saloon. The Nautilus sank several yards below the waves, and the panels were opened. I hastened to the aperture, and under the crustaceans of coral covered with fungi, siphonolus, aleons, madrepores, through myriads of charming fish, grelles, glypsidae, pompharids, diacopes, and holocentres, I recognized certain debris that the drags had not been able to tear up. Iron stirrups, anchors, cannons, bullets, capstan fittings, the stem of a ship, all objects clearly proving the wreck of some vessel, and now carpeted with living flowers. While I was looking on this desolate scene, Captain Nemo said in a sad voice, Commander La Pérouse set out December 7, 1785, with his vessels La Boussole and the Astrolabe. He first cast anchor at Botany Bay, visited the Friendly Isles, New Caledonia, then directed his course toward Santa Cruz, and put into Namusca, one of the Hapai group. Then his vessel struck on the unknown reefs of Vanikoro. The Boussole, which went first, ran aground on the southerly coast. The Astrolabe went to its help and ran aground too. The first vessel was destroyed almost immediately. The second, stranded under the wind, resisted some days. The natives made the castaways welcome. They installed themselves on the island and constructed a smaller boat with the debris of the two large ones. Some sailors stayed willingly at Vanikoro. The others, weak and ill, set out with La Pérouse. They directed their course towards the Solomon Islands, and there perished, with everything, on the westerly coast of the chief island of the group, between Cape Deception and Satisfaction. How do you know that? By this, that I found on the spot where was the last wreck. Captain Nemo showed me a tin plate box, stamped with the French arms and corroded by the salt water. He opened it, and I saw a bundle of papers, yellow but still readable. They were the instructions of the naval minister to Commander La Pérouse, annotated in the margin of Louis XVI handwriting. It is a fine death for the sailor, said Captain Nemo, at last. A coral tomb makes a quiet grave, and I trust that I and my comrades will find no other. Chapter 19 Torres Straits. During the night of the 27th or 28th of December, the Nautilus left the shores of Vanikoro with great speed. Her course was southwesterly, and in 3 days she had gone over 750 leagues that separated it from La Pérouse's group and the southeast point of Papua. Hello. Early on the 1st of January, 1863, Consul joined me on the platform. Master, will you permit me to wish you a Happy New Year? What? Consul? Exactly as if I were in Paris in my study at the Jardin des Plantes. Well, I accept your good wishes and thank you for them. Only, I will ask you, what do you mean by a Happy New Year under the circumstances? Do you mean the year that will bring us to the end of our imprisonment, or the year that sees us continue this strange voyage? Really, I do not know how to answer, master. We are sure to see curious things, and for the last 2 months we have not had time for ennui. The last marvel is always the most astonishing, and if we continue this progression, I do not know how it will end. It is my opinion that we shall never again see the like. I think, then, with no offense to master, that a happy year would be one in which we could see everything. On January 2, we had made a, a 11,340 miles, or 5,250 French leagues, since our starting point in the Japan seas. Before the ship's head stretched the dangerous shores of the Coral Sea, on the northeast coast of Australia. Our boat lay along some miles from the redoubtable bank on which Cook's vessel was lost, June 10, 1770. The boat in which Crook was struck on a rock, and if it did not sink, it was owing to a piece of the coral that was broken by the shock, and fixed itself in the broken keel. I had wished to visit the reef, 360 degrees longitude, against which the sea, always rough, broke with great violence, with a noise like thunder. But just then the inclined planes drilled the Nautilus down to a great depth, and I could see nothing of the high coral walls. I had to content myself with the different specimens of fish brought up by the nets. I remarked, among others, some germons, a species of mackerel as large as a tunny, with bluish sides, and striped with transverse bands, that disappeared with the animal's life. These fish followed us in shoals, and furnished us with very delicate food. We took also a large number of gilt heads, about 1.5 inches long, tasting like dories, and flying pyropeds like submarine swallows, which, in dark nights, light alternately the air and water with the phosphorescent light. Among the molluscs and zoophytes, I found in the meshes of the net several species of alcyonarians, echini, hammers, spurs, dials, cerits, and hylaceae. The flora was represented by beautiful floating seaweeds, Laminariae, and Macrocystis, impregnated with the mucilage that transluces through their pores, and among which I gathered an admirable Nemastoma Honoris that was classed among the natural curiosities of the museum. 2 days after crossing the Coral Sea, January 4, we sighted the Papuan coasts. On this occasion, Captain Nemo informed me that his intention was to get into the Indian Ocean by the Strait of Torres. His communication ended there. The Torres Straits are nearly 34 leagues wide, but they are obstructed by an innumerable quantity of islands, islets, breakers, and rocks that make its navigation almost impracticable. So that Captain Nemo took all needful precautions to cross them. The Nautilus, floating betwixt wind and water, went at a moderate pace. Her screw, like a cetacean's tail, beat the waves slowly. Profiting by this, I and my 2 companions went up onto the deserted platform. Before us was the steersman's cage, and I expected that Captain Nemo was there directing the course of the Nautilus. I had before me the excellent charts of the Strait of Torres made out by the hydrographical engineer Vincent Dumoulin. These and Captain King's are the best charts that clear the intricacies of this strait, and I consulted them attentively. Round the Nautilus, the sea dashed furiously. The course of the waves that went from southeast to northwest at the rate of 2.5 miles broke on the coral that showed itself here and there. "This is a bad sea," remarked Ned Land. "Detestable indeed, and one that was not suitable to like the Nautilus. The captain must be very sure of his route, for I see there pieces of coral that would do it for its keel if it only touched them slightly." Indeed, the situation was dangerous, but the Nautilus seemed to slide like magic off these rocks. It did not follow the routes of the Astrolabe and Zélie exactly, for they proved fatal to Dumont d'Urville. It bore more northwards, coasted the island of Murray, and came back to the southwest towards Cumberland Passage. I thought it was going to pass it by, when, going back to the northwest, it went through a large quantity of islands and islets, little known, toward the island Sound and Canal Malvais. I wondered if Captain Nemo, foolishly imprudent, would steer his vessel into that pass where Dumont d'Urville's 2 corvettes touched, when, swerving again and cutting straight through the west, he steered for the island of Gilboa. It was then 3 in the afternoon. The tide began to recede, being quite full. The Nautilus approached the island that I still saw with its remarkable border of screw pines. He stood off it about 2 miles distant. Suddenly a shock overthrew me. The Nautilus just touched the rock and stayed immovable, laying lightly to port side. When I rose, I perceived Captain Nemo and his lieutenant on the platform. They were examining the situation of the vessel and exchanging words in their incomprehensible dialect. She was situated thus: 2 miles on the starboard side, appeared Gilboa, stretching from north to west like an immense arm. Towards the south and east, some coral showed itself, left by the ebb. It had run aground, and in one of those seas where the tides are middling, a sorry matter for the floating of the Nautilus. However, the vessel had not suffered, for her keel was solidly joined. But if she could neither glide off nor move, she ran the risk of going forever fastened to these rocks, and then Captain Nemo's submarine vessel would be done for. I was reflecting this when the captain, cool and calm, always master of himself, approached me. An accident? I asked. No, an incident. But an incident that will oblige you, perhaps, to become an inhabitant of this island from which you flee? Captain Nemo looked at me curiously and made a negative gesture, as much as to say that nothing would force him to set foot on terra firma again. Then he said, "Besides, Mr. Aronnax, the Nautilus is not lost. It will carry you yet into the midst of the marvels of the ocean. Our voyage is only begun, and I do not wish to be deprived so soon of the honor of our company." "However, Captain Nemo," I replied, without noticing the ironical turn of his phrase, "the Nautilus run aground in open sea. Now the tides are not strong in the Pacific, and if you cannot lighten the Nautilus, I do not see how it will be reinflated." "The tides are not strong in the Pacific. You are right there, Professor, but in Torres Straits one finds still a difference of a yard and a half between the level of high and low seas. Today is January 4, and in 5 days the moon will be full. Now, I shall be very much astonished if that complacent satellite does not raise these masses of water sufficiently, and render me a service that I should be indebted for." Having said this, Captain Nemo, followed by his lieutenant, redescended to the interior of the Nautilus. As to the vessel, it moved not, and was immovable, as if the coralline polypi had already walled it up with their indestructible cement. "Well, sir," said Ned Land, who came up to me after the departure of the captain. "Well, friend Ned, we will wait patiently for the tide on the 9th instant, for it appears that the moon will have the goodness to put it off again." "Really? Really?" "And this captain is not going to cast anchor at all, since the tide will suffice," said the consul simply. The Canadian looked at the consul, then shrugged his shoulders. "Sir, you may believe me when I tell you that this piece of iron will navigate neither on nor under the sea again. It is only fit to be sold for its weight. I think, therefore, that the time has come to part company with Captain Nemo." "Friend Ned, I do not despair of this stout Nautilus, as you do, and in 4 days we shall know what to hold on to the Pacific tides. Besides, flight might be possible if you were in sight of the English or Provençal coasts, but on the Papuan shores it is another thing, and it will be time enough to come to that extremity if the Nautilus does not recover itself again, which I look upon as a grave event." "But do they know, at least, how to act circumspectly? There is an island. On that island there are trees. Under those trees terrestrial animals, bearers of cutlets and roast beef, to which I would willingly give a trial." "In this, friend Ned's right," said the consul, "and I agree with him. Could not master obtain permission from his friend Captain Nemo to put us on land, if only so as not to lose the habit of treading on the solid parts of our planet. I can ask him, but he will refuse. "You must risk it," asked Conseil, "and we shall know how to rely upon the captain's amiability." To my great surprise, Captain Nemo gave me the permission I asked for, and he gave it very agreeably, without even exacting from me a promise to return to the vessel. But flight across the New Guinea might be very perilous, and I should not have counselled Ned Land to attempt it. Better to be a prisoner on board the Nautilus than to fall into the hands of the natives. At 8 o'clock, armed with guns and hatchets, we got off the Nautilus. The sea was pretty calm. A slight breeze blew on land. Conseil and I rowing, we sped along quickly, and Ned steered the straight passage that the breakers left between them. The boat was well handled and moved rapidly. Ned Land could not restrain his joy. He was like a prisoner that had escaped from prison, and knew not that it was necessary to re-enter it. "Meat! We are going to eat some meat! And what meat?" he replied. "Real game! No, bread indeed. I do not say that fish is not good, we must not abuse it, but a piece of fresh venison, grilled on live coals, will a grilled be very ordinary course." "Gourmand," said Conseil, "it makes my mouth water." "It remains to be seen," I said, "if these forests are full of game, and if the game is not such as will hunt the hunter himself." "Well said, Mr. Aronnax," replied the Canadian, whose teeth seemed sharpened like the edge of a hatchet. "But I will eat loin of tiger, if there is no other quadruped on this island." "Friend Ned is uneasy about it," said the Conseil. "Whatever it may be," continued Ned Land, "every animal with 4 paws without feathers, or with 2 paws without feathers, will be saluted by my first shot." "Very well. Master Land's imprudences are beginning." "Never fear, Mr. Aronnax," replied the Canadian. "I do not want 25 minutes to offer you a dish of my sort." At 8:30 the Nautilus boat ran softly aground, on a heavy sand, after having rapidly passed the coral reef that surrounds the islands of Gilboa. Chapter 20. A few days on land. I'll take a really quick break. I'll be back in some 5 minutes. Back. Marty. Mm. So, chapter 20, A Few Days in the Land. I was much impressed on touching land. Ned Land tried the soil with his feet, as if to take possession of it. However, it was only 2 months before that we had become, according to Captain Nemo, passengers on board the Nautilus, but in reality, prisoners of its commander. In a few minutes, we were within musket shot of the coast. The soil was almost entirely madreporical, but certain beds of dried up torrents, drilled with debris of granite, showed that this island was of the primary formation. The whole horizon was hidden behind a beautiful curtain of forests, enormous trees, the trunks of which attained a height of 200 feet. Were tied to each other by garlands of bindweed, real natural hammocks, which a light breeze rocked. They were mimosas, ficuses, casuarinae, tax, hibisci, and palm trees, mingled together in profusion, and under the shelter of their verdant vault grew orchids, leguminous plants, and ferns. But without noticing all these beautiful specimens of Papuan flora, the Canadian abandoned the agreeable for the useful. He discovered a cocoa tree, beat down some of the fruit, broke them, and we drank the milk and ate the nut, with a satisfaction that protested against the ordinary food on the Nautilus. Excellent, said Ned Land. Exquisite, said Plaisance. And I do not think, said the Canadian, that they would object to our introducing a cargo of cocoa nuts on board. I do not think he would, but he would not taste them. So much the worse for him, said Council. And so much the better for us, replied Ned Land. There will be more for us. One word only, Master Land, I said to the harpooner, who was beginning to ravage another cocoanut tree. Cocoa nuts are good things, but before filling the canoe with them, it would be wise to reconnoiter and see if the island does not produce some substance not less useful. Fresh vegetables would be welcome on board the Nautilus. Master is right, replied Conseil, and I propose to reserve 3 places in our vessel. One for fruits, the other for vegetables, and the third for venison, of which I have not yet seen the smallest specimen. Conseil, we must not despair, said the Canadian. Let us continue, he returned, and lie in wait. Although the island seems uninhabited, it might still contain some individuals that would be less hard than we on the nature of game. Ho, ho, said Ned Land, moving his jaws significantly. Well, Ned, cried Conseil. My word, returned the Canadian. I begin to understand the charms of anthropophagy. Ned, what are you saying? You, a man-eater? I should not feel safe with you, especially as I share your cabin. I might perhaps wake one day to find myself half devoured. Friend Conseil, I like you much, but not enough to eat you unnecessarily. I would not trust you, replied Conseil. But enough, we must absolutely bring down some game to satisfy this cannibal, or else one of these fine mornings Master will find only pieces of his servant to serve him. While we were talking thus, we were penetrating the sombre arcs of the forest, and for 2 hours we surveyed it in all directions. Chance rewarded our search for eatable vegetables, and one of the most useful products of the tropical zones furnished us with precious food that we missed on board. I would speak of the breadfruit tree, very abundant in the island of Gilboa, and I remarked chiefly the variety destitute of seeds, which bears in Malaya the name of rima. Ned Land knew these fruits well. He had already eaten many during his numerous voyages, and he knew how to prepare the eatable substance. Moreover, the sight of them excited him, and he could contain himself no longer. Master, he said, I shall die if I do not taste a little of this breadfruit pie. Taste it, friend Ned, taste it as you want. We are here to make experiments. Make them. It won't take long, said the Canadian. And provided with a lentil, he lighted a fire of dead wood that crackled joyously. During this time, Conseil and I chose the best fruits of the Artocarpus. Some had not then attained a sufficient degree of maturity, and their thick skin covered a white but rather fibrous pulp. Others, the greater number yellow and gelatinous, waited only to be picked. These fruits enclosed no kernel. Conseil brought a dozen to Ned Land, who placed them on a coal fire, after having cut them in thick slices, and while doing this repeating, You will see, master, how good this bread is, more so when one has been deprived of it so long. It's not even bread, added he, but a delicate pastry. You have eaten one, master? No, Ned. Very well, prepare yourself for a juicy thing. If you do not come for more, I am no longer the king of harpooneers. After some minutes, the part of the fruits that was exposed to the fire was completely roasted. The interior looked like a white pastry, a sort of soft crumb, the flavor of which was like that of an artichoke. It must be confessed this bread was excellent, and I ate of it with great relish. What time is it now? Asked the Canadian. 2 o'clock at least, replied Conseil. How time flies on firm ground, sighed Ned Land. Let us be off, replied Conseil. We returned through the forest, and completed our collection by a raid upon the cabbage palms that we gathered from the tops of the trees. Little beings that I recognized as the abrom of the Malays, and yams of a superior quality. We were loaded when we reached the boat, but Ned Land did not find his provisions sufficient. Fate, however, favored us. Just as we were pushing off, he perceived several trees, from 25 to 30 feet high, a species of palm tree. These trees, as valuable as the Artocarpus, justly are reckoned among the most useful products of Malaya. At last, at 5 o'clock in the evening, loaded with our riches, we quitted the shore, and half an hour after we hailed the Nautilus. No one appeared on our arrival. The enormous iron-plated cylinders seemed deserted. The provisions embarked. I descended to my chamber, and after supper slept soundly. The next day, January 6, nothing new on board, not a sound inside, not a sign of life. The boat rested along the edge, in the same place in which we had left it. We resolved to return to the island. Ned Land hoped to be more fortunate than on the day before with regard to the hunt, and wished to visit another part of the forest. At dawn we set off. The boat, carried on by the waves that flowed flowed to shore, reached the island in a few minutes. We landed, and thinking that it was better to give in to the Canadian, we followed Ned Land, whose long limbs threatened to distances. He wound up the coast towards the west. Then, fording some torrents, he gained the high plain that was bordered with admirable forests. Some kingfishers were rambling along the watercourses, but they would not let themselves be approached. Their circumspection proved to me that these birds knew what to expect from bipeds of our species, and I concluded that if the island was not inhabited, at least human beings occasionally frequented it. After crossing a rather large prairie, we arrived at the skirts of a little wood that was enlivened by the songs and flight of a large number of birds. "They are only birds," said Conseil. "But they are eatable," said the harpooner. "I do not agree with you, friend Ned, for I see only parrots there." "Friend Conseil," said Ned gravely, "the parrot is like pheasant to those who have nothing else." And I added, "This bird, suitably prepared, is worth knife and fork." Indeed, under the thick foliage of this wood, a horde of parrots were flying from branch to branch, only needing a careful education to speak the human language. For the moment they were chattering with parrots of all colors, and grave cockatoos who seemed to meditate upon some philosophical problem, whilst brilliant red lories passed like a piece of bunting carried away by the breezes. Papuans with the finest azure colors, and in all a variety of winged things most charming to behold, but few eatable. However, a bird peculiar to these lands and which has never passed the limits of the Aru and Papuan Islands was wanting in this collection, but fortune reserved it for me before long. After passing through a moderately thick copse, we found a plain obstructed with bushes. I saw then these magnificent birds, the disposition of whose long feathers obliges them to fly against the wind. Their undulating flight, graceful aerial curves, and the shading of their colors attracted and charmed one's looks. I had no trouble in recognizing them. "Birds of paradise!" I exclaimed. The Malays, the Malays who carry on a great trade in these birds with the Chinese have several means that we could not employ for taking them. Sometimes they put snares at the top of high trees that the birds of paradise prefer to frequent. Sometimes they catch them with the viscous bird lime that paralyzes their movements. They even go so far as to poison the fountains that the birds generally drink from. But we were obliged to fire at them during flight, which gave us few chances to bring them down. And indeed we vainly exhausted one half of our ammunition. About 11 o'clock in the morning, the first range of mountains that formed the center of the island was traversed, and we had killed nothing. Hunger drove us on. The hunters had relied on the products of the chase, and they were wrong. Happily, Conseil, to his great surprise, made a double shot and secured breakfast. He brought down a white pigeon and a wood pigeon, which, cleverly plucked and suspended from a skewer, was roasted before a red fire of dead wood. Whilst these interesting birds were cooking, Ned prepared the fruit of the artocarpus. Then the wood pigeons were devoured to the bones and declared excellent. The nutmeg with which They are in the habit of stuffing their crops, flavors their flesh and renders it delicious eating. Now, Ned, what do you miss now? Some four-footed game, Mr. Aronnax. All these pigeons are only side dishes and trifles, and until I have killed an animal with cutlets, I shall not be content. Nor I, Ned, if I do not catch a bird of paradise. Let us continue hunting, replied the consul. Let us go towards the sea. We have arrived at the first declivities of the mountains, and I think we have better regained the region of the forests. That was sensible advice, and was followed out. After walking for 1 hour, we had attained a forest of sago trees. Some inoffensive serpents glided away from us. The birds of paradise fled at our approach, and truly I despaired of getting near one, when Consul, who was walking in front, suddenly bent down, uttered a triumphal cry, and came back to me bringing a magnificent specimen. Ah, bravo, Consul! Master is very good. No, my boy, you have made an excellent stroke. Take one of these living birds and carry it in your hand. If master will examine it, he will see that I have not deserved great merit. Why, Consul? Because this bird is as drunk as a quail. Drunk? Yes, sir, drunk with the nutmegs that he devoured under the nutmeg tree, under which I found it. See, friend Ned, see the awful effects of intemperance. By Jove! Exclaimed the Canadian. Because I drank gin for 2 months, you mustn't needs reproach me? However, I examined the curious bird. Consul was right. This bird, drunk with the chase, was quite powerless. It could not fly, it could hardly walk. This bird belonged to the most beautiful of the 8 species that are found in Papua and in the neighboring islands. It was the large emerald bird, the most rare kind. It measured 3 feet in length. Its head was comparatively small, its eyes placed near the opening of the beak and also small, but the shades of color were beautiful, having a yellow beak, brown feet and claws, nut-colored wings with purple tips, pale yellow at the back of the neck and head, and emerald color at the throat, chestnut on the breast and belly. 2 horned downy nets rose from below the tail that prolonged the long feathers of admirable fineness, and they completed the whole of this marvelous bird that the natives have poetically named the bird of the sun. There, good morning, Johnny. But if my wishes were satisfied by the possession of the bird of paradise, the Canadians were not yet. Happily, about 2 o'clock, Ned Land brought down a magnificent hog from the brood of those natives called Beryotang. The animal came in time for us to procure real quadruped meat, and he was well received. Ned Land was very proud of his shot. The hog, hit by the electric ball, fell stone dead. The Canadian skinned and cleaned it properly, after having taken half a dozen cutlets, destined to furnish us with a grilled repast in the evening. Then the hunt resumed, which was still more marked by Ned and Consul's exploits. Indeed, the 2 friends, beating the bushes, roused a herd of kangaroos that fled and bounded along on their elastic paws. But these animals did not take flight so rapidly, but what the electric cable could stop their course. "Ah, Professor!" cried Ned Land, who was carried away by the delights of the chase. "What excellent game! And still too! What a supply for the Nautilus! 2, 3, 5 down, and to think that we shall eat that flesh, and that the idiots on board shall not have a crumb." I think that in the excess of his joy, the Canadian, if he had not talked so much, would have killed them all. But he contented himself with a single dozen of these interesting marsupials. These animals were small. They were a species of those kangaroo rabbits that live habitually in the hollows of trees, and whose speed is extreme. But they are moderately fat and furnish at least estimable food. We were very satisfied with the results of the hunt. Happily, Ned proposed to return to the disenchanting island the next day, for he wished to depopulate it of all the eatable quadrupeds. But he reckoned without his host. At 6 o'clock in the evening, we had regained the shore. Our boat was moored to the usual place. The Nautilus, like a long rock, emerged from the waves 2 miles from beach. Ned Land, without waiting, occupied himself about the important dinner business. He understood all about cooking well. The bari outang, grilled on the coals, soon scented the air with a delicious odor. Indeed, the dinner was excellent. 2 wood pigeons complete this extraordinary menu. The sago pasty, the artocarpus bread, some mangoes, half a dozen pineapples, and a liquor fermented from some cocoa nuts overjoyed us. I even think that my worthy companion's idea had not all the plainness desirable. "Suppose we do not return to the Nautilus this evening," said Conseil. "Suppose we never return," added Ned Land. Just then a stone fell on our feet and cut short the harpooner's proposition. We look at Chapter 21, Captain Nemo's Thunderbolt. We looked at the edge of the forest without rising, my hand stopping in the action of putting it to my mouth, Ned Land's completing its office. "Stones do not fall from the sky," remarked Conseil, "or they would merit the name of aerolites." A second stone, carefully aimed, that made a savory pigeon's leg fall from Conseil's hand, gave still more weight to his observation. We all 3 arose, shouldered our guns, and are ready to reply to any attack. "Are they apes?" cried Ned Land. "Very nearly. They are savages." "To the boat," I said, hurrying to the sea. It was indeed necessary to beat a retreat, for about 20 natives armed with bows and slings appeared on the skirts of a copse that masked the horizon to the right, hardly 100 steps from us. Our boat was moored about 60 feet from us. The savages approached us, not running, but making hostile demonstrations. Stones and arrows fell thickly. Ned Land had not wished to leave his provisions, and in spite of his imminent danger, his pig on one side and kangaroos on the other, he went tolerably fast. In 2 minutes we were on the shore. To load To load the boat with provisions and arms, to push it out to the sea and ship the oars was the work of an instant. We had not gone 2 cable lengths when 100 savages, howling and gesticulating, entered the water up to their waists. I watched to see if their apparition would attract some men from the Nautilus on the platform, but no. The enormous machine, flying off, was absolutely deserted. 20 minutes later we were on board. The panels were open. After making the boat fast, we entered into the interior of the Nautilus. I descended to the drawing room, from whence I heard some chords. Captain Nemo was there, bending over his organ, and plunged in a musical ecstasy. "Captain!" He did not hear me. "Captain!" I said again, touching his hand. He shuddered, and turning around said, "Ah, it is you, Professor? Well, have you had a good hunt? Have you botanized successfully?" "Yes, Captain, but you have unfortunately brought a troop of bipeds whose vicinity troubles me." "What bipeds?" "Savages." "Savages," he echoed ironically. "So you were astonished, Professor, at having set foot on a strange land and finding savages?" "Savages? Where are there not any? Besides, are they worse than others, those whom you call savages?" "But, Captain, how many have you counted?" "100 at least." "Mr. Aronnax," replied Captain Nemo, placing his fingers on the organ stops, "when all the natives of Papua are assembled on the shore, the Nautilus will have nothing to fear from their attacks." The captain's fingers were then running over the keys of the instrument, and I remarked that he touched only the black keys, which gave his melodies an essentially Scotch character. Soon he had forgotten my presence, and I had plunged into a reverie that he did not disturb. I went up again to the platform. Night had already fallen, for in this low latitude the sun sets rapidly, and without twilight. I could only see the island indistinctly, but the numerous fires lighted on the beach showed that the natives did not think of leaving it. I was alone for several hours, sometimes thinking of the natives, but without any dread of them, for the imperturbable confidence of the captain was catching. Sometimes forgetting them, to admire the splendors of the night in the tropics. My remembrances went to the France in the train of those zodiacal stars that would shine in some hours' time. The moon shone in the midst of the constellations of the zenith. The night slipped away without any mischance. The Icelanders, frightened no doubt at the sight of a monster aground in the bay, the panels were open, and would have offered an easy access to the interior of the Nautilus. At 6 o'clock in the morning of the 8th of January, I went up on the platform. The dawn was breaking. The island soon showed itself through the dissipating fogs. First the shore, then the summits. The natives were there, more numerous than on the day before. 500 or 600, perhaps. Some of them, profiting by the low water, had come on to the coral at less than 2 cable lengths from the Nautilus. I distinguished them easily. They were true Papuans, with athletic figures, men of good race, large, high foreheads, large but not broad and flat, and white teeth. Their woolly hair, with a reddish tinge, showed off on their black shining bodies like those of the Nubians. From the lobes of their ears, cut and distended, hung chaplets of bones. Most of these savages were naked. Amongst them I remarked some women dressed from the hips to knees in quite a crinoline of herbs that sustained a vegetable waistband. Some chiefs had ornamented their necks with a crescent and collars of glass beads, red and white. Nearly all were armed with bows, arrows, and shields, and carried on their shoulders a sort of net containing those round stones which they cast from their slings with great skill. One of these chiefs, rather near to the Nautilus, examined it attentively. He was perhaps a Mado of high rank, for he was draped in a mat of banana leaves, knotted round the edges, and set off with brilliant colors. I could easily have knocked down this native who was within a short length, but I thought that it was better to wait for real hostile demonstrations. Between Europeans and savages, it is proper for the Europeans to parry sharply, not to attack. During low water, the natives roamed about near the Nautilus, but were not troublesome. I heard them frequently repeat the word "Assai," and by their gestures I understood that they invited me to go on land, an invitation that I declined. So that on that day the boat did not push off, to the great displeasure of Master Land, who could not complete his provisions. This adroit Canadian employed his time in preparing the viands and meat that he had brought onto the island. As for the savages, they returned to the shore about 11 o'clock in the morning, as soon as the coral tops began to disappear under the rising tide. But I saw their numbers had increased considerably on the shore. Probably they came from the neighboring islands, or very likely from Papua. However, I had not seen a single native canoe. Having nothing better to do, I thought of dragging these beautiful limpid waters, under which I saw a profusion of shells, zoophytes, and marine plants. Moreover, it was the last day that the Nautilus would pass in these parts. If it floated in open sea the next day, according to the Captain Nemo's promise. I therefore called Conseil, who brought me a little light drag, very like those for the oyster fishery. Now to work. For 2 hours we fished unceasingly, but without bringing up any rarities. The drag was filled with Midas ears, harps, melames, and particularly the most beautiful hammers I have ever seen. We also brought up some holoturias, pearl oysters, and a dozen little turtles that were reserved for the pantry on board. But just when I expected it least, I put my hand on a wonder, I might say a natural deformity, very rarely met with. Conseil was just dragging, and his net came up filled with divers ordinary shells, when, all at once, he saw me plunge my arm quickly into the net to draw out a shell, and heard me utter an oncological cry, that is to say, the most piercing cry that a human throat can utter. "What is the matter, sir?" he asked in surprise. "Has master been beaten?" "No, my boy, but I would willingly have given my finger for this discovery." "What discovery?" "This shell," I said, holding up the object of my triumph. "It is simply an olive porphyry, genus olive, order of the Pectinibranchidae, class of gastropods, subclass of mollusca." "Yes, Consul, but instead of being rolled from right to left, this olive turns from left to right. Is it possible?" "Yes, my boy, it is a left shell." Shells are all right-handed with hair receptions, and when by chance their spiral is left, amateurs are ready to pay their weight in gold. Consul and I were absorbed by the contemplation of our treasure, and I was promising myself to enrich the museum with it, when a stone, unfortunately thrown by a native, struck against and broke the precious object in Consul's hand. I uttered a cry of despair. Consul took up his gun and aimed at a savage who was pointing his sling at 10 yards from him. I would have stopped him, but his blow took effect and broke the bracelet of amulets which encircled the arm of the savage. "Consul!" cried I. "Consul!" "Well, sir, do you not see that the cannibal has commenced the attack?" "A shell is not worth the life of a man," said I. "Ah, the scoundrel!" cried Consul. "I should rather he had broken my shoulder." Consul was in earnest, but I was not of his opinion. However, the situation had changed some minutes before, and we were not perceived. A score of canoes surrounded the Nautilus. These canoes, scooped out of the trunk of a tree, long, narrow, well adapted for speed, were balanced by means of a long bamboo pole, which floated on the water. They were managed by skillful half-naked paddlers, and I watched their advance with some uneasiness. It was evident that these Papuans had already had dealings with the Europeans and knew their ships. But this long iron cylinder, anchored in the bay, without mast or chimney, what could they think of it? Nothing good, for at first they kept a respectful distance. However, seeing it motionless, by degrees they took courage and sought to familiarize themselves with it. Now, this familiarity was precisely what it was necessary to avoid. Our arms, which were noiseless, could only produce a moderate effect on the savages, who have little respect for aught but blustering things. The thunderbolt, without the reverberations of thunder, would frighten men but little, though the danger lies in the lightning, not in the noise. At this moment the canoes approached the Nautilus, and a shower of arrows alighted on her. I went down to the saloon, but found no one there. I ventured to knock at the door that opened into the captain's room. "Come in," was the answer. I entered and found Captain Nemo deep in algebraical calculations of x and other quantities. "I am disturbing you," said I, for courtesy's sake. "That is true, Mr. Aronnax," replied the captain, "but I think you have serious reasons for wishing to see me." "Very grave ones. The natives are surrounding us in their canoes, and in a few minutes we shall certainly be attacked by many hundreds of savages." "Ah," said Captain Nemo quietly. "They are come with their canoes?" "Yes, sir." "Well, sir, we must close the hatches." "Exactly, and I came to say to you, Nothing can be more simple, said Captain Nemo, and pressing an electric button, he transmitted an order to the ship's crew. "It is all done, sir," said he, after some moments. "The pinnace is ready, and the hatches are closed. You do not fear, I imagine, that these gentlemen would stave in walls on which the balls of your frigate have had no effect?" "No, Captain, but a danger still exists." "What is that, sir?" "It is that tomorrow, at about this hour, we must open the hatches to renew the air of the Nautilus. Now, if at this moment the Papuans should occupy the platform, I do not see how you could prevent them from entering." "Then, sir, you suppose that they will board us?" "I am certain of it." "Well, sir, let them come. I see no reason for hindering them. After all, these Papuans are poor creatures, and I am unwilling that my visit to the island of Geberun should cost the life of a single one of these wretches. Upon that I was going away, but Captain Nemo detained me and asked me to sit down with him. He questioned me with much interest about our excursions on shore and our hunting, and seemed not to understand the craving for meat that possessed the Canadian. Then the conversation turned on various subjects, and without being more communicative, Captain Nemo showed himself more amiable. Amongst other things, we happened to speak of the situation of the Nautilus, run aground in exactly the same spot in this strait where Dumont d'Urville was nearly lost. Apropos of this d'Urville was one of your great sailors, said the captain to me. One of your most intelligent navigators. He is the Captain Cook of your Frenchmen. Unfortunate man of science, after having braved the icebergs of the South Pole, the coral reefs of Oceania, the cannibals of the Pacific, to perish miserably in a railway train. If this energetic man could have reflected during the last moments of his life, what must have been uppermost in his last thoughts, do you suppose? So speaking, Captain Nemo seemed moved, and his emotion gave me a better opinion of him. Then, chart in hand, we reviewed the travels of the French navigator, his voyage in circumnavigation, his double detention at the South Pole, which led to the discovery of Adelaide and Louis Philippe, and fixing the hydrographical bearings of the principal islands of Oceania. That which your d'Urville has done on the surface of the seas, said Captain Nemo, that have I done under them, and more easily, more completely than he. The Astrolabe and the Zelia, incessantly tossed about by the hurricanes, could not be worth the Nautilus. Quite repository of labor that she is, truly motionless in the midst of the wet waters. Tomorrow, added the captain, rising. Tomorrow, at 20 minutes to 3 p.m., the Nautilus shall float, and leave the Strait of Torres uninjured. Having curtly pronounced these words, Captain Nemo bowed slightly. This was to dismiss me, and I went back to my room. There I found Conseil, who wished to know the result of my interview with the captain. "My boy," said I, "when I feigned to believe that his Nautilus was threatened by the natives of Papua, The captain answered me very sarcastically. I have but one thing to say to you. Have confidence in him, and go to sleep in peace. Have you no need of my services, sir? No, my friend. What is Ned Land doing? If you will excuse me, sir, answered Conseil, friend Ned is busy making a kangaroo pie, which will be a marvel. I remained alone and went to bed, but slept indifferently. I heard the noise of the savages who stamped on the platform, uttering deafening cries. The night passed thus, without disturbing the ordinary repose of the crew. The presence of these cannibals affected them no more than the soldiers of a masked battery care for the ants that crawl over its front. At 6 in the morning, I rose. The hatches had not been opened. The inner air was not renewed, but the reservoirs, filled ready for any emergency, were now resorted to, and discharged several cubic feet of oxygen into the exhausted atmosphere of the Nautilus. I worked in my room till noon, without having seen Captain Nemo, even for an instant. On board, no preparations for departure were visible. I waited still some time, then went into the large saloon. The clock marked 2:30. In 10 minutes it would be high tide, and if Captain Nemo had not made a rash promise, the Nautilus would be immediately detached. If not, many months would pass ere she could leave her bed of coral. However, some warning vibrations began to be felt in the vessel. I heard the keel grating against the half calcareous bottom of the coral reef. At 25 to 3, Captain Nemo appeared in the saloon. "We are going to start," said he. "Ah," replied I. "I have given the order to open the hatches." "And the Papuans?" "The Papuans," answered Captain Nemo, slightly shrugging his shoulders. "Will they not come inside the Nautilus?" "How?" "Only by leaping over the hatches you have opened." "Mr. Aronnax," quietly answered Captain Nemo, "they will not enter the hatches of the Nautilus then that way, even if they were open." I looked at the captain. "You do not understand," said he. "Hardly." "Well, come and you will see." I directed my steps towards the central staircase. There Ned Land and Conseil were slyly watching some of the ship's crew, who were opening the hatches, while cries of rage and fearful vociferations resounded outside. The port leads were pulled down outside. 20 horrible faces appeared. But the first native who placed his hand on the stair rail, struck from behind by some invisible force, I know not what, fled, uttering the most fearful cries, and making the wildest contortions. 10 of his companions followed him. They met with the same fate. Conseil was in ecstasy. Ned Land, carried away by his violent instincts, rushed to the staircase, but the moment he seized the rail with both hands, he, in his turn, was overthrown. "I am struck by a thunderbolt," cried he with an oath. This explained all. It was no rail, but a metallic cable, charged with electricity from the deck, communicating with the platform. Whoever touched it felt a powerful shock, and the shock would have been mortal if Captain Nemo had discharged into the conductor the whole force of the current. It might truly be said that between his assailants and himself, He had stretched a network of electricity which none could pass with impunity. Meanwhile, the exasperated Papuans had beaten retreat, paralyzed with terror. As for us, half laughing, we consoled and rubbed the unfortunate Ned, who swore like one possessed. But at this moment, the Nautilus, raised by the last waves of the tide, quitted her coral bed exactly at the 40th minute fixed by the captain. Her screw swept the waters slowly and majestically. Her speed increased gradually, and sailing on the surface of the ocean, she quitted safe and sound from the dangerous passes of the Straits of Torres. Hmm. Hmm. I think I will stop it here today. This has been a very fun chapter. Mm, I am not sure if next time I will read this on Sunday or Monday yet. I will see how it will be. This is getting exciting now. Mm, so it is. Bye and thanks for watching.